Hi, my name is Eva Steiner and this is my project Psychotherapists Around the Globe. I am interviewing the psychotherapists around the world and asking them the same 8 questions. I am wondering how mental health profession is in their country. Today we are going to Thank you for taking this time for doing this interview with me. Before we start, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Thank you very much, Eva, for inviting me. And funnily enough, I'm half German and I know you're in Berlin. So whilst I'm an Australian and born and bred here, I also consider myself to be half European.
Tell me a little bit about your culture. What is some holiday or tradition that your country celebrates? And if your country would be an emotion, what emotion would it be?
Australian culture is difficult to describe. So I thought I'd maybe talk about it as a bit of a layer cake. There are 3 main layers that I think of when I think of Australian culture. And the first, or the foundational layer, has to be our Indigenous culture. We have a very rich Aboriginal Australian culture. We're the oldest continuous living culture in the world, Aboriginal Australians are. So this is something I feel very proud of and very protective of, and I want to put that right up front. I consider that our primary culture, really. But obviously, we were then colonised. Australia was then colonised by the British in the 1700s, and so we then became a British and Celtic culture, so a lot of influences from Ireland and Scotland and England for the first couple of 100 years. And then after that, we became an immigrant culture. So we then had immigrants flocking into the country from pretty much all over the world, but certainly very high numbers of Asian cultures because we're in Asia Pacific, but also European cultures, wave after wave of Europeans. And now we have perhaps more people coming from the Middle East, from Africa. So we are a huge melting pot. It's very difficult to describe Australian culture as a consequence, other than very multicultural. Within that, we have a particular holiday that I think is worth mentioning, and that's called Australia Day. And Australia Day happens on the 26th of January, and it's actually held on the day that the first fleet arrived in Sydney Harbour. And the first fleet was 11 tall ships that had come from England with colonialists on it from England, but also prisoners, convicts, who were being shipped here for punishment. So the 26th of January 1788 has been marked as the kind of foundation day of Australia. But of course, for the Aboriginal population, it was the most traumatic day of their history. We find ourselves on the 26th of January each year having a pretty big argument at the moment about whether it's an appropriate day to be celebrating Australia, whether that's tenable anymore, and there's been a move to change the date. I think Australia Day kind of sums up pretty well something about Australian culture and the tensions that exist in our country. It's currently still the 26th of January when we celebrate Australia Day, but now a very large proportion of people no longer want to celebrate on that day, and they'll go and attend these other events that are called Invasion Day, Survival Day events with a lot of Indigenous culture and Indigenous musicians. And it's a sort of rejection, I guess, of colonial celebrations. So I think that Australia Day is a day that really sums up where we find ourselves at the moment.
So if I calculate it correctly, there is like around 150 years till today. And it sounds like there is more and more awareness about Indigenous culture. But I am wondering what happened in this 150 years. So what happened before?
That's a very complex story, I think. I think ultimately it was pretty much a genocide, in my view. There was initially some attempt to befriend Indigenous people, to have some kind of perhaps idealistic notion that we could live side by side. And of course, there were some people who made efforts to build relationship with our Indigenous people, but ultimately it was always a violent outcome. and Indigenous people were being annihilated in large numbers fairly quickly because, of course, we had guns. Indigenous people did not. And there was also very proactive attempts to kill them through poisoning and through other means. It's been a really bloody and violent history. It's something that, as Australians, I think we've only just begun to really talk about, as that these were wars that took place in the individual lands, because Aboriginal culture had many, many individual lands with their own cultural practices, their own traditions, their own language, very separate peoples. So as we began to colonise Australia, we encountered all these different people in different parts of the country, and there were some pretty terrible conflicts that then ensued, and obviously, for the most part, Indigenous Australians lost out. It's a pretty bleak picture in reality. As a trauma therapist, I take a very particular view of that history, and I think it's irrefutable that our Indigenous people are horrendously traumatised because of what we've done to them. And that trauma has caused huge issues for Aboriginal Australians. Mental health issues, physical health issues. We had a stolen generation where we took the children from their mothers without consent to place them in white care. So there's just generation upon generation of trauma that we're now having to accept we've caused. The answer to that final part of that question is difficult for me to talk about Australia as a single emotion. I'm not sure I can. But we have this strange dichotomy, I think, between we are a fairly relaxed and happy community. I think Australians generally are very fond of sort of the outdoor life and relaxed life. We like to have barbecues, as everybody knows, and be at the beach and be outside and hang out with your family. So there is some truth to that. There's a sort of a cultural commitment to a relaxed and happy life. But on the other side, I think there's this dark shame that we live with, and that's the kind of undercurrent. So that can feel a bit strange, I think, in Australia, where you have this happy-go-lucky Australian culture underpinned by this shameful, dark past.
How did you become a psychotherapist, and what is your therapeutic approach?
So I'm taking the term psychotherapist and psychotherapy to mean the specific paradigm of psychotherapy versus using the term psychotherapy as a catch-all term for any form of mental health, as it tends to be being used at the moment. So I'm trained as an actual psychotherapist, so not in just using psychotherapy as an approach within the work I do as a counsellor or psychologist, but trained as a psychotherapist. So I wanted to just draw that distinction because this is very important with where psychotherapy finds itself at the moment globally. The term is being used across all sorts of approaches, but psychotherapy is a very specific approach that harks back to Freud and has sort of come forward into a contemporary way of working now that's very distinct. So I trained as what's called a somatic psychotherapist, which is a body-inclusive psychotherapist. And then the other word that was in my training was that it's a contemporary approach, so a contemporary somatic psychotherapeutic approach. And those words are very important and meaningful because they discern that training from, well, other somatic approaches and other approaches that are not contemporary. I found this training by accident, really. I was actually a client in somatic psychotherapy myself, and within a very short space of time, I had a sort of a light bulb moment that I knew that this is what I wanted to do and should be doing. So at that time, there were actually 2 somatic trainings in Sydney, believe it or not. Now there are none. It was a particular moment in time. And so I applied for this training and got in. And it was a 3-year training in contemporary somatic psychotherapy. It was very intensive. It was not just an academic training or academic program. It was very rigorous academically, but it was also very heavily experiential. So we were required to undertake a certain number of hours every year in personal psychotherapy. We also did immense numbers of hours of group process in the training. We did touch work. We learnt and practiced biodynamic massage. According to Gerda Boyerson, who was in Germany actually in the 60s and 70s, teaching this as one of the grandmothers, if you like, of body work. We learnt all forms of body inclusive approach, right down to actual touch and everything in between. And yeah, it was a very, very intensive training. So that training, which is almost 20 years ago that I did that now, was considered very fringe at the time. Nobody understood it. When we graduated as new graduates, we were sort of on the outer rim, I guess, of mental health in Australia, and we were considered really strange. The fact that we referenced the body, our own and the clients, and the fact that we would even touch clients was just so taboo and so strange. And so it's been a really interesting period of time to then see how a trauma-informed approach and a body-inclusive approach, what people are calling somatics now, has sort of come to the fore, and it's now gaining popular interest and understanding. So it's been a bit of a long haul for me. That's 20 years of being a fringe dweller and finding myself now, I guess, at this cutting edge place. So the approach I describe as an embodied relational approach. And that just encapsulates that it is body inclusive in all the ways that we need to be. That means that we're doing work on our own embodiment as a practitioner, but that we're also attuning to the client's embodied experience in the therapeutic session. It also means understanding neuroscience. It also means having a trauma theory grounding. It means understanding interpersonal neurobiology, so the relational aspect of embodied relationship. So regulation theory. I'm also trained in just understanding the body generally, what its systems are, how it's all interconnected, what the body-mind interface is, what that looks like, and how we work at that level. And the relational part of embodied relational refers to a more psychoanalytic underpinning of the work. So again, sort of right back to Freud and everything subsequent to that, understanding how our psychoanalytic and psychological theories have developed and using contemporary theory, so human development theory, attachment theory, self-psychology, and intersubjectivity theory, for example, to inform the therapeutic relationship. These two things can't be separated out anymore in a contemporary understanding. We can't work in an embodied way without also working relationally, and we can't work relationally without also being in an embodied paradigm. So that's the sort of broad brush of how I would describe the way I work. I think the only place I've seen it really written up as an approach is by Alan Shaw, who is probably the most amazing theorist of our time. He's a doctor of, what does he call himself? Neuropsychology, I think, in LA. And he wrote a book called The Science of the Art of Psychotherapy. And in that book, and indeed in his own work, he's come to this same conclusion, that we have to be working in both an embodied and a relational way with clients in a two-person psychology. So that was quite an amazing experience after almost 20 years of practicing this way to read it actually described in this book that he's written, if anyone's interested in checking it out.
And did I understood you correctly? There is no such approach anymore in Sydney? Like you cannot get educated anymore?
Yes, these two psychotherapy colleges that were specifically somatic psychotherapy have both closed. This was not long after I graduated in 2007. What happened in Australia at that moment, I'm not sure whether this is also your experience, but until then, you could only study psychotherapy in a private training college. Psychotherapy was not an academic area of study in a university. And the reason for that is the lineage of psychotherapy requires a training. It's not just a cognitive approach. It's not just theoretical. It's not just conceptual. So to be a psychotherapist, you have to actually train yourself, your embodiment, your empathy, your attunement, your presence, your consciousness. You have to have your own therapeutic process, and you have to sort of tune your instrument, which is yourself, to be able to undertake the work, with these human issues that we have with clients. So obviously to achieve that, you have to be doing a rigorous training, and that was always in a private college for forever and a day. Around the time I graduated, there was a massive shift in Australia that took psychotherapeutic trainings and turned them into academic qualifications. And so these little colleges couldn't survive because they couldn't accredit the training to be like a university course. Cost tens of thousands of dollars to take the training you've been offering for decades and to accredit it in the way that the new sort of authorities and government bodies required. So there was a real death of these small colleges at that time, which is very unfortunate. And they were replaced by tertiary programs, for example, a master's in counselling and psychotherapy that is really just an academic qualification with no training and no embodiment and no group process and no personal therapy requirement, no actually, developing the actual skills and developing the self that is required to undertake psychotherapy. So there was a very big shift around that time.
And now, in general, these days, how can you become a psychotherapist? Do you need like this college degree? Do you need to be a psychologist, or can you go directly to studies like you did?
So this is such an interesting question. So psychotherapy is a very small world in Australia. We're very much behind the rest of the world when it comes to psychotherapy. Most people would not know what psychotherapy is. When people ask me what I do, and I say I'm a psychotherapist, they almost always follow up with a question, what does that mean? I don't understand. I've never heard of that before. That gives you some indication of kind of where we find ourselves. We're very dominated in Australia by clinical psychology, who go off, of course, to do a science degree at university and then have to be registered, and then they come into mental health practice. And in Australia, clinical psychologists are funded by the government. So clients can have free or almost free cognitive behavioural therapy with a registered clinical psychologist. So that's also happened within the 20 years I've been practicing. It wasn't like that when I graduated, but within the first 5 years, this new program was rolled out. And so most people now, when they have what we call mental health issues, will go to a doctor to get a referral to go to a clinical psychologist. Psychotherapists are not provided with a provider number for that scheme. We're not included. So we've sort of been marginalised, is my view, and we're at a point right now where we're really trying to make a claim a bit, I guess, on the term psychotherapy. And in the one professional association we have that does include psychotherapists, they're mostly counsellors, but they will include psychotherapists. That professional association has just for the first time in August formally developed what's called a College of Psychotherapy. And it's the first formal entity for psychotherapists to sort of belong to, where we're thrashing out, well, what even is psychotherapy? What do we define it as? And what do we consider to be necessary to join the college and become a registered clinical psychotherapist? Because at the moment we have every man and their dog calling themselves psychotherapists suddenly, when they've in fact not trained as a psychotherapist. So anyone can use the term at the moment. So it's a really important time, I guess, for psychotherapy in Australia. I'm very passionate about this subject. I think it's not helpful when we use terminology in loose ways. It's not helpful for us within the profession, and it's certainly not helpful for clients who are trying to navigate this very complex reality between counselling, psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry and social work, psychoanalysis. For most clients, it's just all the same thing. And unless we get good at describing and defining for them, what's what it is, what it isn't, what I do, what I don't do, it gets really complicated and really messy for clients. I think that's the reason I'm so passionate about it. I want clients to be informed so they can make the right decision for themselves.
How can you work as a psychotherapist? So I'm talking about trained psychotherapists.
Till now, private practice was always the only way you could work as a psychotherapist because, as I said, it wasn't understood as a term. But more than that, I think it was where it was understood, it was not regarded highly. Unless you were a clinical psychologist, you could not even get a look in to working within an institution or an organisation. No chance. Our professional association is making headway slowly on that, trying to educate the government and other bodies, the Department of Health, as to the specific role of psychotherapy, the kind of work that we really excel at, where we could be very useful, and to try and allow psychotherapy to be understood and accepted in formal jobs in various workplace settings. There's a few places where now the job ad will include psychotherapist, but again, I would say that a lot of those require you to have a master's in psychotherapy, which, as I say, is just a tertiary qualification and is not a training, and therefore, generally speaking, means the person has no development as a psychotherapist, as a person. So that's a bit of a moot point for me too. They may have a master's in counselling and psychotherapy, but that doesn't mean they actually can do the work in the field. It's very problematic. It's very complicated. It's very messy. And right at this moment, we're trying to sort of define these things a bit in the public sphere.
How society looks upon psychotherapy or any psychological help?
As I said, psychotherapy is only just emerging in Australia as an approach or a paradigm in its own right. I think primarily in Australia, mental health has been medicalised. The medical model is very dominant. People now see mental health issues as medical issues, requiring them to go to a doctor and get a referral to a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist. That's very different to the psychotherapeutic understanding of mental health issues as human issues, and that we address them within a humanistic paradigm of understanding and a humanistic approach, where we understand that our psychology, as we call it, is a very complex thing, and it has its roots in our childhood. It has its roots in all experience that we've had over our lifetime. In my case, I also understand it as intersecting with embodied experience. So we can't really even talk about mental health anymore because that term is very discreetly around the mind, whereas we're actually body minds, we now know. So I think we're still pretty archaic in Australia. We're still pretty conservative. We're very medically oriented. But over time, there is a shift. I've noticed that clients are rejecting, in a way, that approach. They've often gone off and tried clinical psychology and CBT and haven't particularly found it helpful, hasn't necessarily addressed their issues at the depth that they're looking for or resolved them in the way they'd hoped. So I think that we're just in a time now where the Australian people are looking to other approaches from this traditional way of working. So again, I just want to reiterate, psychotherapy is distinct from clinical psychology. That's the reality. In America, I know that clinical psychologists call themselves psychotherapists or therapists. In Australia, that's not really the case. Like, psychologists don't really use the word therapist particularly. But psychotherapy is not just a psychotherapeutic approach that you might use as a clinical psychologist or as a counsellor or social worker or psychiatrist. A psychotherapist is somebody whose entire way of working is psychotherapeutic. So I wanted to just make that differentiation. That psychotherapy is being used as a cover-all term, and that's not correct. It's a very distinct training and a distinct way of working. It's a long-term approach. It's a depth approach. It's a psychoanalytically informed approach. It's highly relational. It uses a therapeutic relationship as the key vehicle for change. There's all sorts of distinct things about psychotherapy that set it apart from other ways of working.
Have you noticed any mental health stigma?
I think that's changed a lot in the time I've been practicing. I think perhaps 20 years ago there was still quite a bit of stigma, but I think that's changed enormously. I see it in the younger people and their acceptance of how common mental health issues are, that it's okay to talk about them, it's okay to be going to see someone, it's okay to have mental health days where you don't go to school or you have a day off work. I think that's changed a lot in Australia. We were very conservative, but now it's a lot more up to date.
What is your society teaching about child-parent relationship, and whether these values of society also influence how you design your interventions as a therapist?
That's such a fabulous question. I'm really interested in this question myself in terms of cultural influences in the parent-child relationship. In Australia, historically, we have had a very behavioural approach to parenting. This has had quite significant consequences in society. I think as a culture, historically, we've not dealt particularly well with emotions, with affect, and we haven't really taken time or had an approach to parenting where we addressed the emotions of the child, the needs of the child, the kind of relational aspect of children's needs and child development. We've focused a lot on good behaviour and bad behaviour. We've focused a lot on parenting with incentives or, punishments. And I think the consequence for Australians has been some pretty significant damage to children around their emotions, in particular probably boys who then grow into men who don't have great ability to express their emotions, to regulate their emotional states, and so on. I think we are still largely dominated by behavioural ideas, unfortunately. I still hear a lot of this with clients and in the community, a kind of perpetuation of ideas that I think we've actually long moved past from a therapeutic point of view. So it's a bit slow, but gradually I think we're moving towards a more attachment theory informed idea of parenting, an approach that's more relationship oriented and looking to understand what's going on beneath the behaviour. But I see that we're still in our infancy, excuse the pun, on that. We have a long way to go in Australia before we would be anywhere near, in my view, what's understood, for example, probably in the UK, certainly in America, and even in Europe. I think you guys are way, way ahead of where we're at in parenting.
If an adult client would come to you and say, I don't want to contact with my parents anymore, I don't want to see them anymore, how would you approach as a therapist, and how would society look upon such a request?
Well, that's a really appropriate question because that's a very common phenomenon for me. I work in what's known as relational trauma. That's my expertise. Relational trauma is most commonly where the parent-child relationship has caused the child trauma. So where the parents were extremely unsafe in some way or another. The hallmark of relational trauma is it doesn't necessarily have to have any physical aspect to the abuse or to the neglect. It's all occurring interpersonally between the child and the parent. Most of my clients do at some point consider whether they're going to continue to have relationship with those parents or not. And this is a complex issue. I see this as something that you need to take quite a lot of time with. And it's very important to me that the client comes to their own decision around this and that I haven't influenced the client in either way. But as a trauma-informed practitioner, I'll just say that safety is always at the fore in the work. Whatever is going to support the client to feel safe tends to be the leading edge in their recovery. And for many clients, that can involve going no contact with their parents. If not permanently, then sometimes for a period of time. And my experience is that during the time there's no contact with the parent or parents, there can be a huge amount of recovery and healing that's able to take place with that very firm boundary that's never been possible up to that point. But I always leave open in my own mind that that client may get to a point where they're able to resume some sort of relationship or contact with the parent, and that they're able then to now do it in a way that they can keep themselves safe in. Sometimes that happens, and sometimes it just is not possible, and that no contact remains in place. I think society in Australia still probably has some quite conservative views on it. We're fond of things like family is everything, you've only got family, and these sorts of terms that make clients feel like there's something wrong with them, that make clients feel that they have to go back into the dysfunctional, toxic, unsafe family system, that make clients feel hugely alone and misunderstood. I have to act in a way as a bit of a buffer between society and the client, and to hold for them that space that allows them to determine what's right for them, irrespective of the views of society.
What are the learned beliefs regarding client-therapist relationship, and can the relationship continue outside the therapy once the therapy process is over?
That is such an important question, Eva. Thank you for asking it. Certainly for me as a psychotherapist, it's extremely clear. There is absolutely no cause or reason at any time in which a psychotherapist could have any form of relationship with their client outside of the therapy room, outside of the therapeutic relationship. In Australia, that is mandated in our Mental Health Act, where the law stipulates certain guidelines around the boundaries of the therapeutic relationship. But as a psychotherapist, we take that further still, and we have a very stringent set of ethical guidelines that is upheld by my professional association. And those ethical guidelines add, more levels of privacy, confidentiality, and ethical consideration. So it's not just a question that you could never have a form of relationship after the therapy has completed. It is also how you have the relationship with the client during the therapy, what the ethical considerations need to be, what the boundaries need to be. I am very rigorous in that regard, and I uphold that aspect of the work very highly. It's critical for the safety of the client that practitioners, in my view, are 100% clear on the parameters and the boundaries in the therapeutic relationship. I've unfortunately heard a lot of stories from clients who've worked with other practitioners where those boundaries were not upheld stringently. And any kind of fudging of that boundary can have a detrimental impact on the client, even in very subtle ways. So we have to be so careful how we're communicating those boundaries with our clients. And we have to be prepared to address this issue in person, face to face, in the work, relationally. We have to be able to repair any ruptures that occur around this issue with the client. We have to be willing to enter into this pretty intense and sometimes confronting area where, for example, a client might be wanting to overstep the boundary. We have to be willing to work with that and understand that. And we have to be willing to do our own work in our own therapy and in our own supervision to understand what kind of transference and countertransference is going on with the client, where the boundaries may be beginning to become sort of less clear or they're being eroded in some way. And I've heard too many stories of mental health practitioners who are not rigorous in that regard and cause huge damage to clients in the therapeutic relationship, which should be the one place where a client can expect to have crystal clear boundaries.
And in case of therapeutic abuse, the therapist is the one that is crossing the line, where the client can turn to.
This is a really important issue, isn't it? This is where, certainly in Australia, it's important for clients that they make sure that the mental health practitioner belongs to a professional association, because that's how they can then lodge a complaint, is through the professional association. That allows them a very clear-cut complaints pathway where these issues can be addressed and where the client is protected and is going to be taken seriously, and the practitioner is then investigated and has to answer to the panel of the professional association. And then, of course, it can go further and go to court and so on if it's a breach of the Mental Health Act. So it's really important that your therapist or psychologist or counsellor or whatever it is that you might be doing has this professional membership as a protection for you as a client.
Is supervision a must for a therapist in your country?
In Australia, supervision is a requirement within certain professional associations. Within my professional association, which is called PACFA, as I said earlier, it's the only one that psychotherapists can belong to. There is a requirement for a certain number of supervisory hours every year, and you have to provide evidence of that supervision. It's all part of renewing your membership. Once a year, you have to provide evidence of all of these things. So yes, supervision is mandated in my professional association.
So, but the way I am hearing you depends on the association.
Yes, I don't think supervision is mandated at the legislation level, but each professional association has its own requirements of its members. And it depends what level of membership that you're at. It tends to be that the more experienced you are, the higher level of membership you have, the more supervision you're required to do. Certainly for psychotherapists, it's rigorous. We must complete certain amounts of psychotherapy supervision with an appropriate supervisor. Otherwise, you just can't renew your membership, which in turn means you really can't practice in Australia. The same goes for professional development. It's mandated. We have to undertake a certain number of hours of professional development to ensure that people are not just languishing on their original training or qualification, and that they're constantly updating their knowledge, their understanding. It's something that I hold as very, very important.
What are the most common complaints that a client comes to therapy for?
I think the clients that I tend to have come to my practice are clients who have a childhood trauma history, but mostly they're unaware that they have childhood trauma. That's because their trauma is not obvious. It wasn't a single event trauma. It wasn't necessarily the kind of thing that they could easily remember or that was ever explicitly discussed in the family. So again, I think, I call that relational trauma tends to be the thing that I most commonly find with clients where there's been quite significant attachment trauma in their early developmental years with their parents. And that has then led them to have all sorts of issues as an adult. Relational trauma leads to commonly a lot of anxiety. It leads to periods of depression. It leads to some pretty specific health conditions that we now know is linked to relational or attachment traumas. And of course, it also leads to relationship issues, whether in intimate relationships, family of origin relationship, parent-child relationship, work relationships, and then relationship with oneself. Relational trauma has just, cuts a swathe really through a person's life. So by the time they find their way to me, they're often in a really bad place. It's often midlife, and their life is kind of falling down around their ears, and they don't know why. And they've been trying to cope in the way that they've coped all their life, often coping strategies developed in childhood, trauma responses developed in childhood. And those coping strategies are no longer working for them. those coping strategies are breaking down in themselves. And so the person is literally just having a massive crisis in some way or another, and they can't understand why. Because often people perceive their childhood as having been, a good childhood, and they think that their parents were good parents, and they think that their family was, nothing to write home about. And even though often parents have, of course, done their very best, very commonly, unfortunately, that parenting has been not good enough parenting. And these clients who come in midlife, as we unpack it, we tend to discover some pretty significant things that went on in their childhood, in relationship with their caregivers. And that's the starting point, I guess, for this long recovery and healing journey.
If you would share one tool, belief, or approach that is a must-have for you as a therapist, what would that be?
I think for me, it's working intersubjectively, which is this two-person psychological approach or a psychoanalytic relational approach. Intersubjectivity turns a lot of traditional therapy on its head, where the therapist was thought of as a kind of blank screen, and the client was projecting in the transference onto the blank screen. And the therapist thought of themselves as not really implicated in what was going on in the client in the session. The therapist has also always thought of themselves as kind of separate from that, and that what goes on in the client in the session is occurring only in the client. And that's a one-person psychology. Intersubjectivity has kind of blown all of that apart and said, we now know way too much to practice like that anymore. And what we have to sort of confront as mental health practitioners is the truth that we are co-creating our experience together in the therapy room every moment. That the therapist is a person in their own right, the client is a person in their own right. They each have their own subjectivities, and together they create this third sort of entity, which is the intersubjective space. And it's in that space that the therapy occurs. So this is a very demanding way to work because there's nowhere to hide as a therapist. I don't sort of act like an expert, or I'm not a blank screen, I'm not detached, I'm not sitting back taking notes. I'm actually having to show up as the person I am within, obviously, a therapeutic context, but to show up as a person and meet the client in this intersubjective space and to relate to them in that space. It's a very dynamic, organic way to work. And it's demanding, as I say, but it's incredibly rich and incredibly fulfilling way to work. Just so thrilled that I was trained this way. So I've got almost 20 years of this way of working, and I just can't imagine working in any other way. I feel incredibly grateful.